In a graveyard behind this little cabin in the woods in the Taunus Hills where we were living. Our father took us every Sunday to her grave. And so we just walked through the woods looking for mushrooms on the side or maybe some wood to burn in the open fireplace. And then we come to the grave and he knelt down and he was stroking the earth of the grave and was sobbing and talking to her. And we children, or I at least, felt very embarrassed to see the old man doing that. And anyhow, how come he was talking to her in the grave when I knew, as I had been told, that she was up in heaven watching on us? In any case, for me, she was up there still this day. I carry on little conversations, murmuring stuff with her rather than to talk to the walls. And the beautiful thing is, she is still 33 years old. That was her age when she left us. I was a lonely child somehow, and my greatest pleasure was to read. And I never allowed myself to grieve the loss of the mother in any ways at that age. But somehow literature, first of course I was just reading boys' stories and so, but very fast I got to books that were beyond my age. Is there a show going on behind me? Very good. Maybe we should. It's not from him that I could gather any aesthetic or artistic categories. For him, art was divided. My films are not always pleasant. That may be still part of my revolt against him. Belated. I thought that the characters I was reading out in the books were first of all more interesting than my own life, but even more alive somehow. I mean, the circumstances and my fantasy just got carried away, and I literally lived in these novels I was reading. I skipped an episode that later became interesting, I should tell you about, is soon after we had moved out to the woods after my mother's death. A year later, through these very same woods, on their jeeps and half-tracks, arrived the American Army. These wonderful young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, from Wisconsin, Iowa, were not. And among them, a lot of black people, but the black soldiers were driving the trucks. Now these trucks were enormous, and we children thought that only people as strong and dark and powerful and fearsome as these black soldiers could drive these heavy trucks. Decades later, when I was in New York doing The Death of a Salesman with Dustin Hoffman and John Malkovich, Arthur Miller explained to me, no, the American Army in the Second World War was not yet integrated. There were no mixed battalions between colored and white people. That only happened in the Korean War. In the Second World War, except for one Marine Corps, blacks were the transport battalions, meaning they were drivers, as they have always been. Anyhow, with us children, the American soldiers, and more especially these dark-skinned ones, were extremely friendly. And we considered them as our natural allies because they had defeated our parents. So we had a common enemy. And that's where I picked up the English I'm practicing now. With this entire American culture which we sucked in through the soldiers first. At that time you must see in this part, in the Rhine-Main area of Germany, and up to this little place in the woods where we were living, which was actually a spa, the bath of the serpents, called Schlangenbad. There were more American men than German men, because the German males, they were either dead or in the war, or else in prison camps where they belonged. So our socialization was an Americanization. And that goes for literature as well. Soon I became someone who went to the America House to go to the library. And on top of Dostoevsky and Balzac, I discovered Hemingway, Faulkner, and also, of course, the série noire, Raymond Chandler, and so on, and Dashiell Hammett. So even though growing up as a German boy, I was actually sort of immersed in American culture. And one thing very strange happened. We went to the movies, of course, to see westerns and to see crime stories. Early Hitchcocks came out. But all of a sudden there was a film d'art, an art film. And it was French. France, after all, was on the other side of the Rhine River. And one was by Cocteau, Orphée. Others were more detective stories, like all the Rififi films, was Cascador, with Simone Signore. And I thought, Americans, to be American seemed natural to me. To be German seemed horrible to me. But to be French seemed exotic to me. So when at our school on the blackboard, there was, when I was 16, there was an invitation to learn French, and therefore to come to a French boarding school for 2 months, I volunteered immediately. Anything to get out already, probably. I was a nomad already by then. I mean, I did not feel attached to my home place in any way. Mi casa es su casa. Take it, and as long as I don't have to stay in it, it's fine with me. I took the train, the address and so on. After 18 hours train ride, the change of station in Paris, go from Gare de l'Est to Gare de Montparnasse. Not speaking a word of French and having a heavy valise to carry, because you were supposed to bring your bed sheets and whatnot. I finally arrived at the platform of a railway station in Bretagne. Because when I saw that this town was on the seaside, I thought, well, that's where I would like to go. After all, I had never seen the sea. There was a priest in the Roman soutane standing there, with lots of buttons and this flat priest hat. Because the school I had picked was not only by the sea, it was also a Jesuit school, with me being a Protestant. Anyhow, I was assigned to this priest's team. The school was divided in teams. You had the boat and sailing team, you had the building team, you had the painting team, and there was a cinema theater team. And I was assigned to this team simply because the priest who had picked me up took care of it. Actually, he went by the name of Picasso, short for Picasso. Not that he looked very much like him, but he had that temperament. And that's how come the very same week I got to France, not speaking a word of French, I was given a part on a stage to rehearse in the afternoon. Of course, it was the smallest part in the piece we had. And I learned these 3 lines by heart, and in a very UNESCO way, whenever I could use them in a conversation, I used them. This was the first French I learned. What was so wonderful about this priest is, that he was just as temperamental as any director I've ever seen, jumping up from our... It was also actually a church room where we were rehearsing. rehearsing, not the proper church, but a little chapel next to it. He'd jump up and to show us how to play a love scene, for instance, you know, like Romeo and Juliet. Totally unaware how ridiculous that looked in his black frock. He gave me the virus of theater and of cinema, because sometimes also he screened movies, and that's where for the first time I saw a silent movie, La Jeanne d'Arc, The Fire. And one day the entire school was invited to go to see a movie in town in the morning instead of having classes. Everybody rejoiced, of course. It was the movie of a former pupil of that school and whose assistant 5 years later I was going to be. It was Alain René's movie Night and Fog, which is shown here in Morelia this week in the frame of the Jean Vigo Award. And this was the very first time that images of the concentration camps were shown on a screen. Before that, it had been judged by the Allies and by everybody that only very special historians and other people could see these images of skeletons, of mountains, of death, of the bulldozers pushing them into the graves. It was not meant to be for a general audience. So, of course, nothing had prepared me for this experience. Of course, we had heard also in Germany at school about the horrors of the Holocaust, but not in a very appropriate and insisting way. So, I was sick, totally, almost fainted during the screening of these images, these shots. However well Alain René presented them, framing them with color shots of the camps today, and so to create a certain distance and not to use them in an exploitive way. But as the lights came on, I had the feeling all 800 kids and the students in the cinema would turn to me and ask me, how was that possible? What were you thinking? Of course they didn't. But whenever I spoke with them in the schoolyard in the days to come, I had the feeling that this question was somehow on their faces. I never heard it. Nobody ever behaved in a hostile way towards me. But I felt the curiosity that from now on I was truly different. And when before I had tried very hard to assimilate, to be French, now more often I heard people asking me a question commencing with, now you as a German, what do you think, what do you feel, or this reaction was typically German. So the longer I was in France, the more German I became. I had to assume the identity I had been trying to escape. I had a lot of time to do that, because when the 2 months were over that were planned to pick up some French in the school,